In the years really right before World War One, but also in the years immediately following World War One and up and through the 1960s and 70s, there's a period of massive migration of people of color, particularly African Americans, from southern cities up to northern cities, northern industrial cities, where they could get good factory jobs with unions and pensions in northern cities that they were not available to them in the South. But along with that, I should also say that the South was certainly had Jim Crow era laws. They had for formal segregation, what we would call de jure segregation, of law segregation, legal segregation. In the North, this was not a utopia, right? This was not as if, they came into the North and life was miraculously better. That was certainly not the case. However, in the North, there were opportunities for them to receive jobs that would provide better livings for their family and better lives for them in general. And these would be, again, if they lived in the South, there were only really agricultural jobs. Now, agricultural jobs have a couple of big problems. Number one, in the South, there was still tenant farming, which I hope you remember from our first couple of discussions earlier in this semester. You also have, as I've said, de jure segregation, legal segregation that limits a person's ability to do pretty much anything. But in the North, there was less legal segregation, certainly still segregation, what we would call de facto segregation of the fact, meaning that they were barred from certain areas. They were, based on sort of community outlining, right? They would not be allowed in certain areas. Later we would call these things redlining. But for many people, for many African Americans, it is in response to items in the South, right? And Black migration, North is certainly very popular in the years when there are more economic opportunities in the North. We call, obviously, the 1920s the Roaring Twenties. And the reason for that is that there is post-war, after World War I, economic growth, industrial output that gives people new opportunities for them to start moving north and have decent jobs, right? There are cars that are being produced in places like Detroit. You have, refrigerators becoming consumer products and people using them, in their homes and having consumer credit to purchase those items, right? I mean, you have to think as the economy starts booming in the 1920s, right? So we come out of World War One, and if we'll look at this chart, right? We come out of World War One with billions of dollars in GDP, right? Well, that continues to grow, right? We've if you remember the earlier video, the United States has produced goods to sell to Britain, France, and Russia, the Allies. And when the war ends, it's not like they just close up those factories and shut off the lights and say, okay, well, that's been great. They repurpose these factories so that there are still rights, there are still things that people can be, still things that people can purchase. And you have this economic growth and consumer credit. And as the GDP is continuing to go up, right, people get better jobs, people are able to buy things, right? You can use credit now to purchase your car or your microwave, your refrigerator, your radio. And these become major things that people can buy. And obviously, the saying, the rising tide lifts all ships, right? Well, it might be an unequal rise, right? But it certainly does help everybody get better money. And what we talk about here is obviously a growth in spending. And that's why we call it the Roaring Twenties, right? This economic success is obviously what drives a lot of people north, right? Again, these stable jobs in the north offer opportunity for African Americans to move into these cities such as Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, even though Baltimore is obviously in Maryland, very close to the south, New York, Rochester, New York, Boston, Cleveland, Cincinnati, right? You have all these major cities that people can start going to. What we also start talking about here is the Harlem Renaissance. Obviously, in New York City, one of the places to which African Americans go is Harlem, and you have a really great clustering of people who start expressing African American sentiments about their own experiences, right? What we mean by that, or what I mean by that, is African Americans start talking about our experience. And what's important to see there is that there is now a cultural flourishing of people's own ideas about things that are happening to them. And there's this sort of, if you want to talk about it in sort of sociological terms, right, this idea of a class consciousness. This is our experience. And this becomes expressed in things like music, poetry, literature, painting, right? So you have, in music, you have people like Billie Holiday. In poetry, you have people like Langston Hughes, and all of these others, right? And this refers to a general, sort of all, I guess you might think of this as all African American literature and art in this period, right? In the way that we sort of generalize the banking industry with Wall Street. The Harlem Renaissance is really sort of any African American artwork, and art being sort of the general term here during this period. So when we think about the 1920s, right, the prosperity that is being experienced is not equal, right? In the 1920s, in the rural environments, that would be less true. There is not the sort of general feelings of prosperity in the Midwest. And that's because the agricultural industry has taken a huge hit. The agricultural industry was booming during World War I when people were buying food, and then obviously it was being shipped across the Atlantic Ocean for the soldiers abroad. That changes obviously when we start thinking about the end of the war, right? We no longer need to send tons of food across the Atlantic Ocean, so the agricultural industry begins to suffer. And again, we'll talk more about that next week. And that's what you can see here, right? During World War I, you see massive amount of exports, massive amount of economic growth, but then it sort of plateaus. But it's also important to notice that the United States is really the only game in town, right? Britain, France, Germany, Italy, these are countries that do not have the ability to have economic growth in the years after World War I because they have been, they're trying to rebuild their countries. They don't have the ability to do the types of economic growth and factory production the United States would have. The United States also goes into what is called economic nationalism. They put on some really high tariffs to restrict economic goods coming in from across the Atlantic Ocean. The Hawley-Smoot tariff is one of them, and this is what we call economic nationalism. Putting in order to protect the U.S. economy, we put up high barriers so that it's cheaper for you to buy American products and not European products. For the people of Germany, they are forced to pay huge reparations, right? These are amounts of money that, basically bankrupt Germany. This is repayment for the things that the Germans have done during World War I. And it is, again, the purpose of this is to punish Germany, to repair, right? The word reparation. What ultimately happens is a huge devaluation in the German money, the mark, and it ultimately means that the United States needs to begin helping out with what's called the Dawes Plan and then the Young Plan. The Dawes Plan and the Young Plan are loans to the German government to the tune of about $2.5 billion, and it's then helps them pay off their debts. Pay off their debts to the Allies, and then the Allies can pay off their debts to the American government. But, as you can see here, this basically makes one giant feedback loop. So the 1920s, is a period of, the Roaring Twenties I don't think is a bad moniker for the age. What I do think is that it is overly simplistic. It is not, it doesn't take into account the sort of beginning of the failings in the agricultural industry. It doesn't begin to start to talk about the failings that are going to come up in the personal and consumer credit industries, right? Where we have all of these people who don't need new cars and do not need refrigerators, purchasing cars and refrigerators. So I think these are things that are, that are glossed over when we talk about the Roaring Twenties, but it is certainly a period of great economic growth within the United States.